Hi, my name is Peter, and in this video we're going to be discussing classical society in Florence. If you know much about the Renaissance at all, you're probably familiar with the idea that there was a rediscovery of antique society going on, which this means is Roman and Greek texts, a little bit of Arabic too, but mostly Roman and Greek that were really sort of the foundations of a lot of modern scientific disciplines. If you think about Aristotle, we inherited sort of his classification system for our species. We still, in fact, use it today. If you think about sort of political theory, there was Aristotle as well, but mostly if you think about the Republican tradition, you come with figures like Polybius and Cicero, and these were people who were very influential in sort of shaping what Florence wanted to become. This is largely a phenomenon that happened during the 14th century. The scholar Jacob Burckhardt says the great and general enthusiasm of the Italians for classical antiquity did not display itself before the 14th century. And as he states himself, and many other historians state this, that the Florentines are sort of the prototype, the trial grounds for the Italian society, and they themselves went through the same transition. This was happening for them in the 14th century. But how did this process of rediscovery actually go about? This is a good question. For the answer to this, we can look at a few specific examples of people who represent the kind of person who was pushing antique ideals and reading antique texts. We know of a figure named Niccolò Nicolai, who was a member of the Medici circle and was a scholar and someone who was quite influential, and he lived his life exactly as a person in antique society would. He arranged his villa to be just in the style of the Romans. He had frescoes done on his walls. He dressed himself and dined like a Roman. This was the type of person that was surrounding the most influential political decision makers in Florentine history. People like this encouraged restorations and translations to be made of classical antique works, and the Medicis, as the cultural leaders of Florence, obliged these people. And since Florence was a center of scholarship, the general fascination with antique scholarship became really the driving force behind this rediscovery. And I mentioned Arabic is studied as well, and this was one of the few places after the establishment of trade with Alexandria that Arabic was taught really in Europe. This was not a commonly taught subject. From antique thought came the beginnings of humanism. Many scholars have agreed on this, and in Florence it seems to be the case, because right when humanism begins to be on the rise, 13th and 14th century, it is in the same time as the introduction of antique thought, and a lot of Florentine thinkers attributed their beliefs to some of the classical thinkers. Humanism being the immediate sort of prioritization of human interests, doing things for the good of the people rather than some abstract purpose or ideological reason, but doing things for the actual well-being of the people directly. One of the interesting ways in which you can see classical society's influence in Florence is the influence of Aristotle's approach to natural history. Natural history really made its start on the Italian peninsula, and Florence exemplifies how this kind of went about. Florence, in the Medicean villa Careggi, had the first sort of botanical garden. It was an unprecedented collection of trees and shrubs named and classified according to the delineations of Aristotelian natural philosophy. This was the beginning of, the modern conception of a museum, things being collected and arranged in a way that really just celebrated their existence and wasn't just for beauty or something like that. Another interesting way that antique society affected Florence was the way in which it inspired the resurgence of cartography, that is, map making. The great poet Petrarch, actually, took influence from ancient Roman cartographers and put together a great series of maps, some of our best from the time, that exemplify this new fascination with geography. This would be very helpful for trade routes, and Venetians were great with this, but the Florentines also, as being a hub of the Renaissance, also got a lot of this new skill introduced to their city. The field of classicism, or the study of the classics, really begins in the Renaissance. This is the period when we begin to classify the times of Greece and Rome together as some sort of linear intellectual tradition, and then study those things as a model for our own lives in the modern Western world. The writings and works of philosophers like Epicurus and Plato made themselves known in Florentine society. The great ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, once said that he would find it very hard to be a Christian, much less a good person, if it were not for Platonic philosophy. It was in ways like this that classical society and the Hellenistic world really made themselves known during the Renaissance, especially in Florence.